Thank you for the nice introduction and good evening, everyone. It's great to be here virtually with all of you, and I'm excited to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is lichens. So I'll try to cover a few different elements of the lichen realm as Cynthia described tonight. Um, uh, and I just want to thank my colleague Lolita Calabria for letting me use some of her slides in addition to some of my own slides tonight. So tonight I'll start by talking about what lichens are. I'll discuss how we recognize them, a few parts of lichens to know that are useful for trying to identify them. I'll talk a little bit about how humans have used lichens. Um, I'll talk a little bit about lichens as environmental indicators. And finally, at the very end, I will answer the burning question that I'm often asked, which is, do lichens harm or kill trees? So this may be a slightly ambitious range of topics to cover in under an hour, but we'll see how it goes. Um, so for anyone who's not already familiar with lichens, welcome to the lichen world. Happy to initiate you. So lichens are symbiotic relationships between multiple organisms. Lichens are symbiotic relationships between one or more fungi, as well as at least one partner that photosynthesizes, which can be either an alga or a cyanobacterium. And lichens usually have a ascomycete as the primary fungus. This is one of the major groups of fungi. Morel mushrooms and cup fungi are also examples of ascomycetes. But basidiomycete yeasts, which are related to the guild mushrooms, can also occur in lichens. So we've started to think of lichens as little miniature ecosystems. In the old days, we thought of them as just a partnership between fungi and algae. But we know now that they're really more than just two partners in many cases. In fact, there can be many different organisms all living in and around lichens. Trevor Goward described lichens as fungi that discovered agriculture, agriculture being the photosynthesis that algae provide, or cyanobacteria. So lichens are mostly made up of fungal material. When you are holding a lichen in your hand, maybe 95% of the biomass is the fungi. So in this diagram, the stuff that looks like spaghetti is the fungi, the fungus. The stuff that looks like peas is the algae. So thin layer of algae under the surface of the lichen that's photosynthesizing. But the fungus provides the majority of the biomass and some functions, including helping the algae grow places where it couldn't grow otherwise. So we can have either green algae or cyanobacteria as the photosynthesizing partner. And cyanobacteria, in addition to providing food for the lichen, can also fix atmospheric nitrogen. So basically, they can have a fertilizing effect for the lichen. One thing to know about lichens is they can look really different when they're wet and when they're dry. So you might think a lichen is two different things in its wet and dry forms. So it's always good if you're trying to get to know a new species of lichen, it's good to see what it looks like wet and dry. Lichens are poikilohydric, which means they maintain moisture in equilibrium with their environment. So when they dry up, lichens go completely dormant. But when they're wet, lichens come alive and photosynthesize. So in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of our lichens are dormant during the summer when it's dry. So this is the time of year that the lichens really love in our part of the world. Lichens play a lot of important ecological roles. We could talk for a whole hour just about that. They are a major component of biodiversity in a lot of ecosystems. They provide habitat and food and shelter for many organisms. They play roles in succession and nutrient cycling. And finally, they are really useful for environmental monitoring. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later this evening. So when you're learning to identify lichens, um, the first step is learning the three major groups that we place lichens into. And these are the crustose, foliose, and fruticose lichens. Crustose lichens are lichens that are totally oppressed to the substrate they grow on. So you can't really scrape them up. They don't really have edges that peel up away from the substrate. So these include a lot of lichens that grow on rocks, but also we have crustose lichens on bark and other substrates. Foliose lichens are the leaf-like lichens. These are lichens that have a distinct upper and lower surface, and they may be somewhat oppressed to their substrate, but they're not entirely oppressed to their substrate. They may not be very oppressed at all. And then the fruticose lichens are the hair-like lichens. These are the lichens that have the most surface area. They're the least oppressed to the substrate. They're really three-dimensional, and they can grow either in a pendulous form where they're hanging down or in more of a shrubby upright form. So if you can learn to tell which group your lichen is in, that's a good first step towards being able to figure out what it is. One thing that's important when you're learning to identify lichens is, or paying attention to lichens at all, is noting what substrate lichens grow on, because lichens can be quite picky about what they grow on. So, for example, some lichens might grow on hardwoods, but not conifers, or they might even grow only on certain species of hardwoods and not every kind of hardwood. Same thing for rocks. Some lichens may grow only on more calcareous rocks and not more acidic rocks. So noting, if you find a lichen growing on a tree, it's good to make a note of what species of tree you saw it on. And I'd say bark and rocks are the two most common lichen substrates, but lichens can grow on almost anything that holds still. In the tropics especially, there are a lot of lichens that grow on leaves of plants, which we call foliiculous lichens. And lichens grow on soil in many parts of the world as well. Here in the Northwest, east of the mountains, sagebrush country, the high desert, great soil crust lichens out there. And we also find lichens growing on mosses, on cars, on signs, fence posts. Yeah, really lots of things. There are certain animals, such as long-lived tortoises, that lichens can grow on too. And we refer to the body of an individual lichen as the thallus. So one individual lichen, you could call that a lichen thallus. And one of the first things to learn when you're learning about lichens is how to tell them apart from mosses. Mosses and lichens are ecologically fairly similar. They often grow together. But one difference is mosses have leaves, little tiny leaves, but they're still there. And lichens don't have leaves. Lichens don't have differentiated vegetative structures at all. Mosses are often fairly bright greenish in color, and lichens can be bright green in color, but they're often other colors. And lichens can be just about any color of the rainbow. Um, so that's the first step. Once you can tell lichens and mosses apart, you're well on your way to identifying lichens. And the next thing I was planning to do was play this little game where I show you lichens and you tell me whether you think the photo is a lichen or not. But I'm realizing with the webinar format, this may be a little hard because I don't think I can actually see comments from the audience. Is that right, hosts?
That's correct, but I can turn it on if
Oh
you
yeah, if you could
would
turn it
like.
on, that'd be great.
Okay.
That'd be great. That'll really help the game. So the way this game works is I will show you a photo, and then you can tell me in the comments if you think it's a lichen or not, and see if I can. We'll see if I can stump you on at least one of these photos. Um, Shuju, will you just tell me when it's
Oh,
ready?
yes, it's turned on.
It's ready. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. We are ready to play the game. So I'm going to show you the first photo. First question: is this a lichen or not? Okay, I have already stumped one person. Yeah, so this is not a lichen. This is some old flyers stapled to a telephone pole, but sometimes mistaken for lichens from a distance. Okay, how about this one? This yellow stuff. Okay, We're getting some varying votes here, but this is actually a slime mold. So this is not a lichen. This is an organism that's related to fungi. It's not really a fungus. It's what we used to call a protist. Lichens are usually not quite that squishy looking. Okay, on this one, do you think there are any lichens in this photo? Yes, yeah, people are saying yes, and that's correct. So, but it's important to point out the gray stuff here with the little black discs, that's the lichen here. The orange stuff is actually free-living algae. So, if you thought the orange stuff was the lichen, you're wrong. But if you thought the gray stuff was the lichen, good job.
So the
Okay,
chocolate chip looking things?
yeah, so
Okay,
the gray stuff is the body of the lichen, and then the black disc-like things are the fruiting bodies of the lichen.
thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, what do y'all think about this green stuff? Is it a lichen? Okay, once again, we have mixed opinions. This is actually a liverwort. So this is a bryophyte. It's related to the mosses. Um, and this is a thalloid liverwort. So in form, it looks a lot like lichens, but one clue is the bright green color. Lichens can be that color, but they're often not. Okay, so this time we're looking at these finger-like, these yellowish finger-like structures. Do people think that those are a lichen? Okay, once again, I have stumped some folks. I'm seeing some no's in the chat. I hate to tell you, but this is in fact a lichen. This is a lichen called Dactylina. The common name is dead man's fingers, and this lichen is grows in the tundra in Alaska, coming down into the lower 48 very rarely, only on high mountains. But yeah, super cool, intriguing lichen. The fingers maybe up to a couple inches tall. It's really a bizarre thing. Okay, how about these? So these are little tiny things that are about 1 millimeter tall. Do you think these are lichens? Yeah, so to the people who said yes, you are correct. This is a lichen. This is a pin lichen. Pin lichens are little tiny microscopic lichens that often grow on bark, sometimes rock, or actually decorticated wood after the bark falls off more often, certainly on bark too. But these little pin-like structures are the fruiting bodies of the lichen. So lichens really do come in a lot of shapes and sizes. What about this white stuff on a tree? This game is impossible. Yes. I understand this may be a frustrating game, but hopefully it's building character for you. Okay, good. I'm glad some people are into the game. Uh, so it looks like I have once again stumped most of the crowd. This is not a lichen. This is a free-living fungus, obviously closely related to lichens. One clue is that lichens often have a bit of a shiny texture, and fungi are often a little bit rougher looking. So this just has a rough look. And with practice, you learn to spot them pretty easily, but it's tricky when you're first starting out. Okay, how about this colorful thing? Do we think this is a lichen? Yes, okay. I didn't stump anyone this time. Yeah, this is a very cool lichen. The common name for this one is Christmas lichen, and this lichen occurs in the southeastern US, Gulf Coast area. Really beautiful lichen. Okay, if you're in the southeastern US and you see this hanging from the trees, is this a lichen? Very important that you're in the southeastern US for this question. Okay, to the people who said no, you're correct. This is Spanish moss, which is a bromeliad, not a lichen. It's actually a vascular plant related to pineapple. But from a distance, it sure looks a lot like a lichen. And if you were in the Northwest and you saw something that looked like this from a distance, it would probably be a lichen because we don't have Spanish moss in this part of the world. Okay, how about this stuff? Do we think this is a lichen? Yes, couldn't fool you on this one. Yeah, so this is reindeer lichen. This grows a lot, well, all over the place, but especially common in boreal regions, and it's a major food source for reindeer. Um, okay, how about the green stuff on this car? Not a lichen. Yeah, good. Okay, so you all have keyed into the difference between mosses and lichens. The bright green color, if we look really closely, there are little tiny leaves there. And finally, how about this stuff? Yeah, can't fool you on that one. Toilet paper in a tree, sometimes mistaken for lichens from a distance. Um, And I'll just tell you this last one. This is actually not a lichen. This is some kind of goo on the sidewalk. But this was about a foot from the goo, and it is a lichen looking very similar. So sometimes they try to trick you. So thanks to everyone for playing. I'm glad I could stump you a few times, but I think you've all built character from the experience. So I'll move on to sharing some tips for identifying lichens. And I'll just mention a few of the features on lichens that are good to learn to recognize because they'll help you if you're trying to figure out what species a lichen is. So when we're looking at lichens to try to identify them, some things we like to look for include the shape of the lichen, the color, the size of the lichen, the structure and frequency of reproductive structures, including fruiting bodies, and then also the lobes, which are what we call the branches of the lichen. So the pattern and angle of branching, the degree to which the lobes adhere to the substrate, and the habit of the primary thallus. So is it spreading, erect, pendant? These are all things that are really useful. And I'm going to focus on reproductive structures, but as just, because we can't cover everything here, but reproductive structures are especially important. If you can see whether there are any reproductive structures and what kind there are, that gets you a long ways towards identifying your lichen. So lichens can reproduce both sexually and asexually. For asexual propagules, the most common kind is what we call Ceridia, and these are basically little clumps of powder that rub off of the lichen and can form a new lichen. The powder contains both the fungal partner and the photosynthesizing partner. So an animal might walk across the lichen and get some ceridia on its legs, and it falls off somewhere and starts a new lichen. And there's another kind of asexual reproductive structures called acidia, and these are different from Ceridia, which we just talked about, because rather than looking like powder, they actually look like little tiny fingers. So, and they can be a little bit shiny rather than having the dull color of the powder. Um, and these are just illustrations of how Ceridia can occur in different places on the lichen thallus. So they can occur in the middle of the lichen, along the edges, which we call marginal, on the tips, which we call terminal, or sometimes even forming a fissure out of a fruticose lichen. So where the reproductive structures are can also be important, in addition to what kind there are. And then lichens can also reproduce sexually, and the most common way they do that is with a structure called apothecia. And these are um, fungal fruiting bodies. So in this case, it's only the fungus reproducing. These structures just produce fungal spores, which fly off somewhere and land and form a new fungus. And then that fungus has to find a suitable photosynthesizing partner to actually form a lichen. And the fruiting bodies or apothecia are often round in shape. They're often disc-like, but they can occur in many different shapes. So this is an example of a cladonia lichen. And on this lichen, the apothecia are the red parts at the very tips of the lichens. And this is just a diagram illustrating some of the different shapes that apothecia can take. So these are all apothecia, which are, again, the fruiting bodies of the lichen, often round, but they can be some really weird shapes too, and kind of irregular looking. So if you can spot apothecia or ceridia or acidia, which again are the vegetative propagules, that can really help you when you're trying to identify a lichen. And this is what apothecia look like in cross section. They have little structures that produce the fungal spores inside there. And when you're identifying crustose lichens, you often have to slice up the apothecium and look at the spores, which is it takes some practice to get good at that. So not recommended for beginners. Better to stick to the macro lichens, as we call them, which are the foliose and fruticose lichens. The larger, more three-dimensional lichens. Those are a lot easier to identify. Um, I mentioned earlier that lichens can have either green algae as their photosynthesizing partner or cyanobacteria. So this is just an example of what lichens with green algal partners can look like. Lichens with green algal partners can actually come in a wide range of different colors, but they're often on the lighter end of the color spectrum. So they're often light greenish, greenish gray, bluish gray, some range of fairly light colors. And then in contrast, that have cyanobacterial partners are often darker in color, often blackish, dark gray, dark brown. Not 100% reliable, but often that's the case. And cyanobacterial lichens are often fairly sensitive species. So you may not see them in, for example, more disturbed environments like urban environments. So I thought I'd share a few slides now about some ways that humans have used lichens in the past and still today. And one question that I'm often asked is whether there are edible lichens. And the answer is yes, but not a lot of them. At least not a lot of lichens that have a long history of being eaten. But by far the most prominent edible lichen in North America is Bryoria fremontii, which has the common name horsehair lichen, and one Native American name for this lichen is willa. And willa is a lichen that grows in drier parts of the Pacific Northwest. It has been a traditional food of multiple indigenous groups, mostly east of the Cascades. It grows in the ponderosa pine zone, drier forests on the eastern slope of the Cascades. And it has been cooked traditionally in pit ovens. So the lichen is taken and cooked down in pit ovens to make these thick cakes. And this is what it looks like after you cook it. I've heard mixed reviews. I've heard some people say it was not so tasty. I've never eaten it myself, but I have met one person who said it was not that bad. So if you get a chance to taste it, I'm interested to hear what you think. But my sense is it may have been more of a food to eat when resources were less abundant rather than a choice delicacy. This is a map of some of the places where it's historically been eaten. And you can see that a lot of these places are on the drier side of the mountains. The red zones are the areas where Willa has been the most important traditional food. Um, and orange are where it was a less important food. The Bible talks about manna from heaven, and it's been speculated that manna from heaven may actually refer to vagrant lichens that are blown in the wind. These are lichens that aren't attached to any substrate. They occur in drier areas of the world. And there's a story, or there's speculation at least, that there may have been edible species of vagrant lichens that blew into a village during a time of starvation and saved the village. I haven't verified this story, but I think it's an interesting enough story. I'm passing it on to you anyway. And it's also important to note that there are some poisonous lichens. Yeah, the most notable poisonous lichen in our region is wolf lichen. But all lichens that have this chartreuse color contain the toxin vulpinic acid, and should be avoided. It's okay to touch them, but not okay to eat them. Wolf lichen, Letharia, was actually used to kill wolves in Scandinavia. It was often combined with other physical and chemical toxins. So it's unclear how toxic the wolf lichen actually was, and how, if it could kill wolves on its own. But definitely better not to eat this one. But it is a great dye lichen. And I have a slide about dyeing with lichens here in a minute. Dyeing, DYE, that is, yeah, important distinction there. Uh, Many lichens contain diverse chemicals, and many of these chemicals are probably evolved to be defense compounds to deter herbivores. So many lichens may be mildly to moderately toxic. Many lichens probably wouldn't kill you right away, but it's generally good to be cautious. Most lichens are not edible. But one of the side effects of the wonderful diversity and fascinating diversity of chemicals that occur within lichens is the fact that lichens can be used to dye fibers and fabrics. And they can actually make a really wide range of colors. So the woman in this photo is wearing the scarf that's entirely dyed with lichens. And this is an example of yarn that's all of these colors are dyed with lichens. So a lot of blues and pinks in particular can be made with lichens. And if you're interested in natural dyeing, what I've been told is that the best place to get involved in the community is through the Facebook group about lichen and fungal dyeing. A very active community of folks out there collecting lichens for dyeing. The world's most economically important lichen is this little unassuming lichen called oak moss lichen. The common name is Avernia prunastri. And this very well might occur in your yard if you live in the Pacific Northwest, especially on the west side of the mountains. Really common lichen. It's all over the place. It isn't particularly picky about where it grows. And it's used to make a fixative that's an ingredient in nearly all perfume. So there's actually a major industry around harvesting this lichen, um, apparently mostly in Europe. And there are long histories of medicinal use of certain lichens. Most notably among them is lungwort, Loberia pulmonaria, which is a fairly common lichen in the Northwest. Loberia pulmonaria was recognized back in medieval times as having tissue that looks like lung tissue. Through the doctrine of signatures which was the idea that things can heal what they look like. People thought that Loberia pulmonaria might actually be medicine for lungs, and it turns out modern science has backed this up. Loberia pulmonaria actually has some efficacy as a medicine for conditions like walking pneumonia and bronchitis. And then the other lichen with a long history of medicinal use is old man's beard, Usnea species, very common in the Pacific Northwest. We have a lot of species that have different chemistry. So I wouldn't recommend taking this lichen internally, but all Usnea species contain usnic acid, which is an antimicrobial compound. And usnic acid um, basically means that Usnea lichen is effectively an antimicrobial gauze that you can use for field first aid. So if you injure yourself and you're in the woods and you're bleeding, Usnea would be one of the best things you could use to pack your wound. And you can use it like gauze for just about anything you would use gauze for. There's a long history of indigenous people using Usnea for first aid and other purposes that gauze is needed for. Pretty safe, probably pretty safe for external use. Actually, an interesting story is on the Western Front during World War I, in the trench warfare in the Alsace-Lorraine. That's a landscape with a lot of oak woodlands, and those oaks are covered with Usnea. And Usnea was actually used to pack wounds on the soldiers, and is credited with helping a lot of soldiers keep limbs that they might have otherwise lost. And so one thing I just want to note when we're talking about the different cultural uses of lichens is it's important to harvest ethically and sustainably. When you harvest a lichen, you're collecting the entire organism, and there's not going to be anything left to grow back. So this is different than collecting mushrooms, where you're just picking the fruiting body. The actual fungus underground is unharmed by the collection of the fruiting bodies. With lichens, we have to be a lot more careful. So my advice is, if you want to, for example, dye something with lichens, it's best to pick up litter fall lichens off of the ground. Especially in the winter, you can find a whole lot of lichens that have fallen out of the canopy onto the ground, and those lichens are going to die. Um, They want, if they live in the forest canopy, they can't survive once they fall on the ground. So those are fair game to harvest. So that's the best way to go about harvesting lichens. And then I also want to talk briefly about how lichens are used in environmental monitoring. Lichens are sensitive indicators of air pollution, and the composition of lichens that are present at a given site actually reflects the air quality of that site. And lichens are sensitive to a lot of different air pollutants, including heavy metals and nitrogen and sulfur compounds. But here in the Northwest, bioactive nitrogen compounds are the most important pollutants for affecting lichens. So you can see from this map that we have elevated bioactive nitrogen along the I-5 corridor in Western Washington and Western Oregon. So bioactive nitrogen comes from car exhaust, building emissions, and agricultural fertilizers, which we have a lot of in this region. So some of the most sensitive lichens won't occur in places with elevated nitrogen at all. But when you see a whole lot of orange lichens covering a surface, that's actually a sign that you're in a place with highly elevated nitrogen. So some of these small orange lichens, like the ones in this photo, are nitrophiles, which means nitrogen lovers. And these lichens actually become more abundant in places with um, elevated nitrogen levels. If you're driving through the Willamette Valley, the agricultural region of the Willamette Valley, or the Central Valley in California, you might see that a lot of the trees are covered in these orange lichens, and that's a response to the air pollution. As you move away from the most polluted areas into areas with perhaps only moderate air pollution, you might start to see lichen communities that look more like this. So some of the lichens pictured here might not occur in the very most polluted places, but they're still somewhat tolerant of air pollution. And once you get into places that look like this, where you have really big three-dimensional lichens just draping off of the trees, that's a sign that you've moved into a place with much cleaner air. These really large three-dimensional lichens don't tolerate high levels of air pollution very well. So once you have learned to recognize some common lichens, they can actually be a really useful tool for assessing the air pollution or as you travel around through the world. Lichens also have a long history of being used as indicators of old growth forests. And I'll just briefly talk about some research I did on this topic. Um, Scientists have recognized for a long time that there are certain species of lichens that seem to only occur in old growth or late successional forest. And a couple of those are pictured here, Nephroma occultum or cryptic paw lichen, and Loberia oregana, which is Oregon lungwort lichen. These are both mostly or entirely restricted to old growth in the Northwest. Um, but in the past, most scientists have simply made lists of old growth indicator lichens. And some colleagues and I got the idea that maybe lichen affinities for old growth forest occur on more of a spectrum rather than being a binary phenomenon. So, maybe some lichens are entirely restricted to old growth, but perhaps there are other lichens that have a strong preference for old growth, but aren't entirely old growth obligates, and so on. So we decided to do a study where we ranked lichens based on how strongly we thought they might be associated with old growth forest. Because we also know that there are lichens that are associated with disturbed habitats. For example, those orange lichens I mentioned earlier, these are lichens that readily colonize new substrates. They, do well after disturbance. They do well with pollution. They don't need old growth habitat. And then we also have lichens that seem to be kind of in the middle. They're not, they might occur in old growth, but they don't need old growth, even though they may not be able to tolerate high levels of disturbance and pollution. So my colleagues and I in this study developed what we called the Lichen Conservation Index, and we ranked all the common Northwest macrolichens on a scale of how strongly we thought they were associated with old growth forests. So we ranked 225 species, and we ranked them on a scale of 1 to 10. So a 1 would be something that's really disturbance tolerant, kind of an early successional weedy lichen species. And a 10 would be a lichen that we think is strictly relegated to old growth forests and won't occur anywhere else. So we ranked all 225 lichens on this scale. And then to test how accurate our rankings were, we used data from the Forest Inventory and Analysis lichen data set. So these are study plots where researchers have gone out and identified all the lichens in 1 acre study plots. And the researchers also recorded how old the forest stand was at each of these study plots. So we were able to look at how lichens are associated with forest stand age, um, and test, whether our rankings actually were associated with forest stand age as we expected. So this figure shows the rankings that we assigned on the x-axis, and then the average stand age where lichens with those rankings occurred on the y-axis. So you can see there's actually a pretty nice relationship between the lichen conservation index and the age of the forest stand where these lichens occur. And then we also, for each of the study plots, we averaged the rankings of all the lichens in each study plot, and we looked at whether that average value was also related to forest stand age. And it actually was. You can see there's a pretty nice relationship here, where as the forest gets older, the average lichen conservation index increases. Um, and this was a much stronger relationship than if we just categorized lichens as either old growth indicators or not. So basically the binary index. Um, so lichens seem to be pretty good indicators of old growth forests in the Pacific Northwest. It was also interesting to see that these rankings were based on our own experience from doing field work with lichens. So it's useful to see that the wisdom of the crowd approach seemed useful. It turns out that our rankings did seem to shake out in the real world. So now I want to get to the burning question that everyone has been waiting for, which is, do lichens kill trees? Um, this is complicated a bit by the fact that it's common for dead trees to be really covered in lichens in the right environments. In fact, it's not uncommon to see a dead tree that has a lot more lichens on it than a living tree near it. And so this might lead people to the conclusion that lichens have in fact killed the tree. But I'm here to tell you that generally lichens do not kill trees, and lichens do not parasitize trees either. Lichens are not actually interacting with the tree in any kind of parasitic fashion. The lichens are just sitting on the surface of the tree. They're not penetrating into the cambium. There may be some cases where really abundant lichens can compete, like cover up the leaves of a tree, and perhaps, act as a bit of a competitor to the tree by competing for light. But that's only going to be in cases where the lichens are really big and dense. I think in general, lichens probably do a lot more to help trees than to hurt them. There's actually some evidence that lichens contain chemicals that can kill sudden oak death, which is a pathogen. So lichens may actually be protecting trees from pathogens in some cases. Lichens also provide ecological services such as what we call hydrobuffering, which is they soak up water when it's really wet and then they release water when it's drier outside. So they provide a more stable hydrologic climate, and they help maintain a constant humidity in the understory of forests. So lichens provide a lot of ecological benefits. They're not killing your tree, but they do need to photosynthesize. So if a tree dies, the leaves fall off, there's more light available. That may be why lichens become more abundant on dead trees in some cases. So I hope that you found this to be a fascinating session on lichens, and I just want to mention a few ways you can learn more about lichens if you're interested. So I'm going to be teaching a lichen identification and ecology workshop at Reed College in Portland in just a couple weeks, and this will be a 2-day workshop where we spend some time in the field. We'll spend some time in lab with microscopes, learning to identify lichens and key them out with the technical literature. And we'll have some lectures too. So some more of what you heard today. So please join us if you're interested. And we still have tickets available, and we can offer sliding scale or free tickets to people who need them. And I guess I have a little symbol over the QR code there, but you can go to that URL. I also want to mention a couple organizations that work with lichens. The Northwest Lichenologists here in the Pacific Northwest are a great organization for everyone who's interested in lichens. We hold an annual meeting every year in March, and we also take field trips sometimes outside of that. And if you ever spend time in California, check out the California Lichen Society. The California Lichen Society holds an annual lichen meeting at the end of January, and we also publish a bulletin that comes out twice a year with all the latest lichen news. And you can read the bulletin for free on the website, so check that out. And then I also want to share a link to my mailing list. If you're interested in learning about other classes and workshops that I'm teaching, you'll get an email about them. And one other thing that I'm going to do again in 2026 is teach a community field botany class where we visit a different wildflower hotspot each month and learn to identify plants with a focus on learning to recognize plant families. So with that, that's everything I have, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jesse. I I learned so much in just a few short minutes. Fascinating stuff. I'm going to click on the Q&A and see if we've got some questions yet. Yes, we do. First question is, do lichens get more than carbon from cyanobacteria?
Yes, they do. So cyanobacteria also fix atmospheric nitrogen, just like legumes do. So they also get nitrogen from cyanobacteria.
Okay. And second question, is it the same with mosses and trees as with lichens?
Yes, it is. Yeah. So same thing, if the mosses get really abundant, they could maybe be competing with the leaves a little bit just by physically covering up the leaves. But in general, they're probably doing more good than harm for the trees. And they're certainly not parasitizing the trees either. So yes, exact same thing.
Okay. And what is the typical lifespan of lichen?
That's a good question. Lichens, in some cases, can live for hundreds or perhaps even thousands of years. But other lichens may be relatively short-lived, like Avernia prunastri, the oak moss lichen, the world's most economically important lichen that I mentioned earlier. It actually branches about once a year, so by looking at it, you can tell how old it is. And I rarely see individuals that are more than about 12 years old of it. So
Okay.
yeah, huge range of lifespans potentially.
Okay. Do we have more questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Oh, wonderful, Shuju.
So yeah, sorry, I can't use the Q&A, so I have to use the audio. For some reason, it doesn't allow me to. So I caught that when they reproduce sexually, it's just the fungal part that reproduces, and then it has to go out and find its own partners. So are they always successful, or do some of them just become they never become lichen?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's almost certainly true that a good number of those fungal spores never actually make it to a good place where they can find algae. So some of them probably die. It's a hard thing to study because fungal spores are so tiny. So I don't think there's a lot of research on that. But it also may be that they get to a spot that would be perfect, but the algae just isn't there. So if they can't find the algae in the wild, it's probably not going to work out for them. So yeah, it's a cruel world out there, but not every spore becomes a lichen.
Okay, so then they just die. They don't become a fungus by itself.
Yeah, so that raises a good point too. Yeah, so these fungi that form lichens, They have lost the ability to live on their own. They're generally obligate, like an obligate. So, yeah, if they can't find the algae, they're not going to be able to live for very long. They can't really develop without having the photosynthesizing partner.
Okay, so a related question, which I think you spoke of, but I didn't understand or I didn't catch it. So they can reproduce as a group?
Uh, yeah. So the vegetative propagules that I mentioned earlier,
Okay,
the Ceridia and the Acidia, those contain both the fungal partner and the algal partner. So those are like a little mini lichen packet, and they get
okay.
dispersed. And when they start growing, everything is already there. So that may be one reason why so many lichens use vegetative dispersal as a reproductive mode.
Okay, thank you. That answers my question.
Yeah, no problem. Is that anything else?
That seems to be it for the questions.